Yeah, well, that was a slightly different take on that song. And as you can probably gather, although I'm leading worship today, it's not really so much about singing songs as about talking about the subject of worship. So why is worship so important? Well, it's actually, I'm not too sure, but it's been recognized in the church as being a really important part of what we do. Um, if you look at our typical service at Eston, roughly half the time that we spend in the church is spent singing, and the other half listening to the message. Um, that's not entirely true, because there's also a bit of prayer that fits into both of those categories. So music is very useful in worship, but it's not essential. Worship can take many different forms. And the thing about worship that it does is it puts everything in its proper place. It puts God where he belongs. And it puts us where we belong. And it puts the world in its place as well. So what worship does is it reminds us that God is God and that we are not. Now, worship's not the only thing that does this. There's a whole category of things, what we would describe as spiritual disciplines, that have this function. Worship's one of them. Prayer is another. Meditation, fasting, reading the Bible. You know, I think it was 2 weeks ago, Gus spoke to us about prayer, and he emphasized the importance of prayer being a two-way communication, that we need to listen. And that process of listening to God helps to put us in our proper place. Meditation is kind of some of us think of meditation more in terms of the Eastern religions, where meditation is more a case of emptying yourself and leaving yourself open. And I think in Christianity, you take one step further. It's not the end result is not to empty yourself of distractions. The end result is to empty yourself in order to fill yourself with God. Fasting's also a very important discipline, and it's been in the church throughout time. But we don't do it so much anymore. I think a lot of its value comes from just acknowledging who's in charge. You know, one of our most basic needs is food. And if we withhold food, it reminds us that we are not in charge of our lives, and that everything we have and everything we do essentially has its source in God. Reading the Bible is a good spiritual discipline too. But it's not about the reading. It's about listening to the message. Now, it might not sound like a spiritual discipline, but last week Dave spoke to us about the subject of giving and generosity. And when you think about it, that also serves a similar purpose. When you give generously, it forces you to look outward and not be so internally focused. So all these disciplines and these activities, they all prepare us for encountering God. But before we can experience God, before we can be filled by him, we must make space for him. It's a little bit like cooking. You know, if you want to cook a nice meal, you don't take yesterday's pot with the leftover food still on the bottom and start adding ingredients. It's not going to turn out well. Or maybe even worse still, maybe you take the pot out the sink that's been soaking overnight in soapy water and start adding your ingredients. It's not going to work. Spiritual discipline is about cleaning the pot. It's about preparing all the equipment you need to encounter God and to be filled with him. Now, as you've probably gathered by now, I'm intending to use the Christmas carol, O Come, Emmanuel, as the kind of framework to build this message around. As I mentioned before, it's my favorite Christmas carol. And so, you might ask, what's so special about it? Well, the first thing is the music. That music, as I said before, it just stirs something within me. And the other thing is the subject material. It deals with our longing for God to be with us. That's literally what Emmanuel means, is God with us. And it's also particularly appropriate in like a couple of days before Christmas, because it speaks of the time before Jesus arrived. And that's where we are right now in Advent. Now, the other thing about it, most Christmas carols are written in the 1700s, 1800s, somewhere around about there. But this one's really, really old. It might have been put to music at about the same time as the others, but it's actually based on a 7-verse poem that dates back to the 8th century. So it's old. Some sources say that that poem was even based on an earlier work from the early church. Now, it's broken into 7 verses, as I mentioned, and each verse deals with a different identity or name for Jesus. And the names of this go like this. The first verse is about Emmanuel, God with us. The second verse is about wisdom from on high. The third verse is about Lord of might, or sometimes translated as lawgiver. The fourth verse is about the rod of Jesse, or sometimes translated the branch of Jesse. Verse 5 is about the key of David. Verse 6 about the day spring, or the bright morning star. And the 7th is about the King of Nations. Now, there are various translations and versions of the carol, and these days we've got a much shorter attention span than in previous generations, so we usually normally sing 2 or 3 verses, and which verses we sing depends very much on who's doing the singing. And in addition to that, there have been extra verses added over time. 2 of the ones I came across were about Jesus, the true prophet, and Jesus, the great high priest. Now, these changes and variations, in my mind, they're perfectly fine. They're okay. This is poetry, not scripture. So, because it's poetic, then whatever speaks to the audience or speaks to the artist that's performing it, that's significant and that's right. So although these changes are okay, it's also true that sometimes things get lost along the way a little bit. I was really fascinated to find out that in the original Latin version, they used a poetic device called acrostic. Now, until I was reading up about this, I didn't even know what acrostic was. But on examining it further, I have encountered it before. So I'm just going to use an example to illustrate what acrostic is. Here goes. Cuddly, acrobatic, tenacious, softly purring. That's a little poem that uses the mechanism of acrostic. It's a couple of phrases or words that describe a cat. But if you look at all the words, the first letter of each word actually spells out the word cats. Cuddly, acrobatic, tenacious, softly purring. So that's the kind of idea. You use the phrases or words in a poem or a song to encode a message in the different lines of that song. And the 7 names of Jesus in the 7 verses of this carol are used to spell out the words ero cras, which in Latin means I shall be with you tomorrow. Isn't that cool? Isn't that so amazing that there's a kind of a hidden message, a message from God encoded in the words of the hymn that we didn't even know about. So moving on to the actual text of the carol, it starts out, or let me read you the first verse. It's called Emmanuel, God with us. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. I'll just like to start off with reading a verse from the Bible, Isaiah 7, verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Okay, the first line, O come, Emmanuel. If you just ponder on this for a moment, it speaks about longing for a relationship with God. You see, ever since the Garden of Eden, there's been a separation. In the garden we walked, Adam and Eve walked side by side with God. But through circumstances and bad decisions made along the way, there's a separation. And for the nation of Israel, communication with God had always kind of been at arm's length. The place that God dwelled was in the Holy of Holies. It was possible for a priest to enter the Holy of Holies, but there was a very stringent set of requirements and rituals and procedures that had to be carried out before a priest could survive that encounter. And part of that procedure and that mechanism was sacrifice. And it's quite interesting. I think that was kind of built in right from the beginning to prepare us and to prepare our minds for what Jesus had to do on our behalf. God also spoke through prophets. And the first verses kind of seems to be set in the time before the arrival of Jesus. And shortly before the arrival of Jesus, there hadn't been any prophets for, I think it was around about 400 years. No prophets, no communication from God. God was silent. The nation had been crying out to him. The next line goes, and ransom captive Israel. I'd like to read to you from Timothy 2, verse 5 and 6. For there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. This has now been witnessed to at the proper time. You see, Jesus is our mediator. He's kind of the bridge. I don't know if you remember, quite a while ago I did a sermon where I used the image of a bridge going across a chasm of fire. And that bridge is Jesus. He's the conduit that we can connect to God. And probably he always has been. It looks like he's been the agent of God's action right from the very beginning. There are various verses that support that. But in this case, he's acted on our behalf and paid the price for our freedom. See, Jesus did not come just as an example of how to live. I think that's important that we remember that at Christmas. Christmas seems to be this kind of happy, cheerful time. And cute babies are great. But there's more to the story than that. He wasn't just a nice guy. He was our interface with God. And he died to make our life possible in fullness. The next line says, that mourns in lonely exile here. See, loneliness speaks of broken relationships with each other and with God. Over throughout its history, Israel had to suffer exile from the promised land. But this goes back even further, goes all the way back to the exile from the Garden of Eden. Now, when I look at this, I see, now please understand what I'm telling you now is after pondering on this and meditating on it and listening on it for days, these are the things I've taken out of it. I'm not saying that what I'm telling you is the truth. I'm just saying that it's what I've heard when I've listened to these words. And I'm pretty sure that these words are going to mean different things to you, because that's the nature of worship and approaching God and being filled with God, is that each one of us is different. And the message that God might have for you in any given moment is almost guaranteed to be different to the message he has for me. But I'm just illustrating, using my personal reaction to these words as an illustration of the depth that there is and the amazing theology that's built into this carol. See, there are three strands of truth for me in this. The first is the kind of historical strand, which is, it's all about the story of the nation of Israel. And that's the obvious one, because most of the words seem to be aimed specifically at that. But I believe there's also an underlying truth, and that's the personal strand. It's about me. It's about how I long for a relationship with God. It's about how I mourn the isolation, the exile that I feel until the Son of God fills my life. Now, Jesus paid the ransom price for my personal, individual freedom. It wasn't just a general, vague idea. It means something to me. And he is the way that I can regain the state of being that I crave, and that state of God with us. Now, the third strand that I'd like to talk about is kind of the global strand, the really big picture. You see, God created everything. He started with the big stuff. He started with the universe and worked his way to the more specific, to the more personal. And his last act of creation was man, Adam. Or more, I suppose, strictly speaking, Eve. And it was good. And then Adam messed up. He made a bad choice, and he was evicted from the garden. And his sin has infected the rest of creation. If you look around, you can see that things are not the way they should be. We can just feel it inside ourselves. The consequences of the sin of Adam still resound, and they get magnified by the bad choices everyone has been making since then. Now, here's the cool thing, and this actually just gets me so excited. What's God's response? For me, the sensible thing would be for God to say, well, I had a go, didn't work out, I'm going to start again. Let's just trash this whole grand experiment, and I'll do it differently next time. But God didn't choose to do that. He chose to fix it, not to start again. And I'm so grateful for that, because that leaves me a place in the plan. You see, the restoration process starts with one man, Jesus. Paul refers to him, I forget where, but he refers to him, it might have been in Romans somewhere, as the second Adam. See, God created it all, created everything from the outside inwards. And now he's busy fixing it from the inside outwards. And this process started with Jesus humbling himself to be born as a helpless human. It wasn't that he acted as a human and he kind of took on the role of being a human. He actually gave up his God identity to become a helpless human, like a baby, like properly helpless. That's where it all started, and that's what we celebrate in a couple of days' time. And then this restoration process carries on, and it ends with the restoration of the entire universe. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That's what it says in the Lord's Prayer. That's what we should pray for, and that's what the goal is. Heaven on earth. And we get to be part of this process. What a privilege. There are lots of things. If we live for eternity, like it seems some of us might, there are lots of things we're going to be doing. But there's just this one window, just the short lifetime that we live now, where we have an opportunity to take part in something that is central to the whole universe, a part of fixing creation. And this project ends with us once again walking side by side with God in the garden. And there's such a beautiful symmetry associated with this plan. It starts big and it works its way down to the small. And then it starts really small and it works its way out to the whole universe. Anyway, I'm carrying on quite a bit, but that's what I get from that first verse. And then following the first verse, it goes on to the refrain, which is kind of like a chorus. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to you, O Israel. Now, you've got to be a bit careful with the punctuation there, because sometimes when you sing it, it almost sounds like Emmanuel's doing the rejoicing. But what it actually means is that Israel is doing the rejoicing, because Emmanuel shall come. And the thing that strikes me there is that Israel is not rejoicing for what has happened. It's rejoicing for what will happen. It's future focused, not living in the past. Now this refrain kind of adds a little bit of depth to the verse we've just read. And it gets repeated after every verse. And it's exactly the same. But it's also not. Because each time you sing the refrain, you've had a new verse. You've got a slightly different understanding. Slightly, the meaning of what you're rejoicing for has changed its texture a little bit. The words are repeated, but the meaning builds with each verse. Now, initially I was planning to do all 4 verses. I mean, not all 4 verses, all 7 verses. But I realized that there's just not going to be enough time. So I'm going to settle for 2. And I've picked the second verse as the one that we seem to hear most often sung nowadays. It's actually verse 4. It's branch of Jesse's stem, or rod of Jesse, sometimes translated. The King James Version translates the text that it comes from as rod, not branch. The verse goes like this: O come, O branch of Jesse's stem, unto your own and rescue them. From depths of hell your people save, and give them victory o'er the grave. And then the refrain comes after that. Now, in case you're not familiar with the story, Jesse was King David's father. And I'd like to read to you Isaiah 11, verses 1 to 2. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord. Now there's a whole bunch in there, and a lot of those refer to other verses in the song. But we haven't got time to go into those links. But when I read that, in my mind, I get an image of a gum tree. I picture along comes a guy with a chainsaw, tree's cut down, looks like it's all over and done with. But if you come back later, or in the case of Israel, about 400 years later, the stump has started to coppice. There's a new shoot growing from the stump. Now, maybe the old tree was damaged during its lifetime. You can think of sin. Maybe the tree was beyond repair, couldn't be fixed. So it needs to be cut down. It needs to die to self, and it needs to be born again. Such cool links to both the Old Testament and the New. See, the new shoot is similar to the old one because it comes from the same roots, but it doesn't have to turn out exactly the same. It can grow up to reach its full potential if it avoids the same source of damage that happened to the first tree. See, for me, the old tree represents Adam and his lineage. The new tree represents Jesus. It's fully human. It comes from the same roots after all, but undamaged by sin. For me, it also represents the personal transformation that each one of us needs to undertake. We need to die to self and be born again. Such strong images, and tree imagery is all over the place in the Bible. In the Garden of Eden, there were lots of trees. We're familiar with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's what led to Adam's downfall. We're familiar with the tree of life. And Adam was denied access to the tree of life. That's why he was kicked out the garden as a result of his sin. But you and I, can be granted access to the tree of life through Jesus. Also, elsewhere in the Bible, the cross that Jesus died on is referred to as a tree. Now, day before yesterday, I went on like a long kind of 5-hour round trip with Kevin to fetch some macadamia trees. There were some that were stolen and others that got frosted. So there were just 150 trees to fill in the gaps and fix things up a bit. And, we spent quite a lot of time chatting in the car. And a lot of that chatting we were talking about music. And we were listening to music the whole way. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking about trees. And the kind of question does arise. This whole song is written from the point of view of Israel. And are we part of Israel? Do we qualify? I think we do. We've been told that we've been adopted into God's family. And you know what adoption means? It means that even though we are biologically not part of that family, even though we don't share the same genes and the same kind of lineage, we've been adopted, which means we share in the full status and the full benefits of being a naturally born child. And that's where we stand. It's like we've been grafted into the tree. We draw our nourishment and we get all our benefits from the root, but it's not our own root. It's the root of Israel, and it's the root of God. And it stretches back to the beginning of time, and it stretches forward to the end of time. And we've been grafted into that tree. We're part of it. I just also quickly like to share you a bit of a story. I think it was told to me by a guy called Butch, he's like an extension officer for the company that we supply our nuts to. And he was talking about guys growing macadamias in the Western Cape. Now, Western Cape's not really the ideal place for them, but the guys had a go, and they were experiencing a lot of difficulty in getting a decent crop, to get a good set of nuts and decent flowering. What some of the guys started doing is they would, it was an orchard of Beaumont, and they started taking cuttings from a 788, which is a different variety, and grafting it into the tree. So basically you ended up with a tree that some of the branches were one variety and others were a different one. And what they achieved by that is a much better nut set, better pollination, and a much bigger crop. I don't know, it kind of refers back to the fruit that passage from the Bible was talking about. So isn't it amazing? You know, we read a couple of lines from an old song. Isn't it amazing the depth of understanding and truth and the kind of theology and all just the knowledge of God that's been built into those few verses. And that's what worship is all about. All you need is a good biblical foundation. You need some time, lots of time, and the right frame of mind. By that I mean an attitude of worship. And you create an environment where God can speak to you. Now, I've looked at 2 verses out of the 7, and I'm already over time, but I can assure you that I've looked at all of them, various depths, and they all 5 remaining ones contain the same sort of insights and linkages to the Bible, connecting the Old Testament with the New, and I just think that's so true of so many aspects of spiritual discipline. You know, if you pray, the more you pray, the more you learn. If you study the Bible, the more you learn to hear the voice of God through what's written in those words. And so I'd like to challenge you to be disciplined in the coming year and to just do all the things that we need to do to give God a chance to speak to us. And so I'd like to close off by playing one last clip. And I'd like to challenge you to sing along. And if you feel uncomfortable about it, try to let go and empty yourself of worldly things like embarrassment. God is not embarrassed when you sing. And as you sing along, try to listen to the music and get lost in it. Get those endorphins and the cannabinoids flowing. The things of the world will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace. So try to empty yourself and listen to the words and try to allow God to fill you with His truth. And like Mary, let's go into Christmas magnifying God. Let's get to a place where God just fills our whole field of view. I'd like to close off with this prayer. And our prayer is this: O come Emmanuel, O come God, and be with us. Amen.